I'd like to thank all our delegates for tuning in as we look forward to one after the other expert sessions. And as I get set to introduce our next session, let me once again request all of you all to please log in and write comments on our signature walls. This is how we get to know how involved all of you are. And this being a very interactive session, we would love to hear what you think about our various sessions and expert panels that we've put together for you as we lead into a very interesting curtain down a conversation, paving way for future women leaders, a fireside chat of creating leaders for a world of change by the leader that we've always looked up to. A very, very warm welcome to Ms. Kiran Mazumdar Shaw, Executive Chairperson at Biocon, and in conversation with her is Ms. Archana Rai, Editor South, The Economic Times. We're looking forward to this very, very candid conversation with both of you all.
Thank you, Isha, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Welcome, Kiran. Really privileged to have you join us this evening and to share your thoughts on what really is a topic of immense interest for women professionals all over. And as we were just talking earlier, I wanted to begin by asking you, and in a time of a pandemic, when so much focus is there on healthcare and all of these various interventions that are required right now, what does it, in pretty much you are both a thought leader and providing solutions for this. How do you view this entire challenge, and what did you sort of think of when you look at your workday at a time during a pandemic as a woman leader?
Archana, this is a time when every business leader needs to reinvent and pivot their businesses to adapt to these very, very starkly changing times. We have all been plunged into a digital world, just like we are having this conversation today. Otherwise, I would have been on a stage having this fireside chat with you. But I think all businesses today have had to adapt very rapidly. So, you've seen, work from home, remote working, all these practices have been very rapidly adopted and adapted to by all businesses, which I think is tremendous. Secondly, we've suddenly seen that digital and digitization of one's operations is becoming very, very necessary. And I think things that were thought of as a 3-year kind of strategy is now having to be deployed in less than a year. So I think every one of us realizes that you have to digitize, you have to make sure that you get into a paperless operating style. And I think we've also realized the importance of doing that, because I think you can do a lot of things in a very interesting way. Today we have, virtual audits, remote audits. Inspections are virtual. We've learned to do a lot of these kind of meetings and come out with very important decision-making processes, which are important for the operations. Everyone's been looking at business continuity, business bounce back. What do we need to do to get back to normalcy, etc., etc. So all of us have learned to deal with these situations, including, how do we keep our campuses safe? How do we introduce, a very well calibrated testing procedure, apart from the other kind of safety measures that you need to take during COVID-19. But I think every business has learned to do that very rapidly. But most of all, I think it's about pivoting one's business. Can I do something different? Can I do something more? Have I missed out something? So it has thrown up opportunities for every business.
That's really true. And it's very interesting that you're using the word pivot. And for a company of the size and the complexity of the business that you now kind of lead, the word pivot and the fact that you have done this so successfully sort of again highlights the various leadership qualities that you'd need actually as a business leader. And I wanted to just step back and ask you, how do you view your journey? Because you really were a classic startup when you began, although in those days, I doubt it was referred to as such. But you would have had your own set of challenges at that time to what and to what you have seen now, say nearly, three decades on, really 4 decades on since you began. What are the common strands that you see in terms of the challenges when you began to now the stage of a pivot that to pivot such a large and complex organization?
So Archana, I'm glad you called me a startup because that's what always I pride myself in. I keep telling people I think I was the first tech startup
but of course,
because I was the proverbial startup in a garage with very little money. I had a real challenging time accessing capital. I had a very challenging time, getting a hold of talent. I think a lot of startups struggle with that, even today, getting the right talent, getting capital to, take their ideas to the market. And in my case, I started off with an idea ahead of its time. Most startups start with that idea ahead of its time.
Yeah.
And then they need to shape and build that idea and get proof of concept and take it to the market. So I went through that journey of building a startup and taking that idea to the market successfully. And the only difference I see is that access to capital was almost impossible when I started my business.
Yeah.
And finding the right talent was also very, very difficult because I was trying to start a biotech company where there was very little talent or ready-made talent, so to speak. Today, I think access to capital is much easier for startups, especially in my area of biotechnology, because the government has stepped in to provide startup capital or risk capital. BIRAC is doing that.
That's right.
Many state governments are doing that. Kitwin and other such state-led venture funds are doing that. And I think the talent is there because there's such a mushrooming of startups in every sector that you do have available talent that you can actually reach out to. So I think it's easier now to be a startup than it was 4 decades ago. But having said that, I think startups still struggle to access the kind of capital they need to take their ideas to the market. So they might get initial funding, but I think they are not able to access the kind of funding that you need to take that idea to the market. And most startups are not willing to take debt, which I did.
Yeah.
I did not have access to any kind of venture funding, so my whole story was a debt-funded story. But I think startups today are very wary of taking debt. They don't want debt. They'd rather do it through more funding, which I find a little strange because I think entrepreneurs need to be a bit resourceful.
Okay, that's an interesting point. So essentially, there is also more private capital available now, which makes it, sort of easier for startups perhaps to access such sources of equity funding and not go in for debt. Why particular? I mean, I'd just like to draw you in further on that point and say why would you think that debt is a more superior source of funding for a startup? Are you saying it brings in greater responsibility in terms of the sort of running?
No, I have always believed, Archana, that bringing in venture capital dilutes your equity, right?
Well, certainly does.
So I think what I've always believed as an entrepreneur who's built an enduring company, I would like to be in control of the company as much as possible. Because I do find that the moment you hand over to a venture fund or a VC, their whole focus is on exit.
True.
And that takes away from your business focus.
Sure.
And then the entrepreneurs constantly struggling to meet the expectations of the investor, the VC. Okay. And I know many companies who keep struggling saying, my VC doesn't want me, doesn't understand I need to do this. They just want exit. They want exit. They want me to sell out. They want me to sell out. And that becomes a very, very difficult position to be in if you're an entrepreneur. So I prefer to raise a debt and then pay back that debt, and I've always paid back my debt. And that gives you more flexibility to decide when you really want an investor in.
There are also newer options, these days, such as venture debt, for instance, which allows entrepreneurs also to, sort of
Yeah.
access different modes of
So there
capital.
is a convertible debt model, I mean, convertible instrument model and things like that. I'm not saying there aren't many. I mean, today you have many investment and, debt, convertible debt models. I was just making the point that today most startups are constantly in the fundraise mode, whether they
Absolutely.
need to be in a business focused mode. And I think when you constantly are in a fundraise mode, you don't have enough time to focus on the business. And
Absolutely.
that's what I meant by it's easier to raise a debt and focus on the business than constantly be fundraising, because it's always about, getting someone to listen to your story and buy into your story, and it always takes time. So fundraise is always much more, time consuming than say a debt raise.
Absolutely. So, in terms of, sort of focusing a little bit more on specific challenges that women entrepreneurs face across the entire gamut of fundraising, of, sort of hiring talent for businesses, you've seen challenges through the last few decades. How would you rate it? And how difficult is it now compared to earlier, from the time that you began, for instance? And what do you see that could change further to make this better for more women entrepreneurs, particularly in the area that you are in the technology and the biotech area?
See, interestingly, I think if you look at the life sciences space, a large number of companies, startups, have had women as co-founders. So I don't think it's a problem in that way, because I think women are finally realizing that they can become entrepreneurs, and at least in our sector, maybe I'm an example or a role model to many of these startups. But the good news is that there are many women startup entrepreneurs in life sciences. I mean, even in the entire tech space, I'm told that there are almost 250 tech startups in the country which either have a woman founder or a co-founder, which is a good number.
Absolutely.
And I think for the last 2 years, we've seen 70 such startups every year having a woman at the head.
Absolutely.
So I think that's a very good number to start with. Now comes the next part, is how many of these companies are actually able to grow, build out, and sort of get into a critical mass scale. That's where the challenge is, because as I said, many of these entrepreneurs are able to find that initial starting capital. But I think where they struggle is at the next level of financing. And that's where I think VCs become very gender biased, because they kind of prefer to invest in male founded companies than women founded companies. And that is, I think, a perception hurdle, because I think women don't push themselves hard enough. And as I always tell people, women make a big idea sound small, and a man makes a small idea sound big. I think women have to learn to tell their stories in a much bigger way. Because I think one of my qualities of success, I would say, was the fact that I could tell my story very well. I could get people excited with what I was doing, and I could give them the potential of my business, which made people wanting to invest in my story. So, for instance, I started as an enzymes company. It was an idea way ahead of its time, because those were not the days of climate change. Those were not. It was an idea about replacing polluting chemical technologies with eco-friendly enzyme technologies. And people thought it was a daft idea, because they said, why would I want to replace my present technology with something like yours when I made all these investments in capital, right? Now, if I want to use your technology, it was a sort of a warped way of thinking, saying, look, that means all this investment I made will go to waste. And I said, no, you can still use the same, technology, same equipment. It's just that you need to use all of it. And you can get better product at the end, but they would never get it that way. They would just feel that, I invested in all these this infrastructure, and now you're telling me I don't need all of it, I can just do with half of it. What a waste. So that was the way I used to look at it, and I had to really educate them about why they needed to do it. So, I had to spend my time, but they got excited. They would say, okay, it's a good idea. And I would tell them about the long-term impact of doing that. So it was about telling your story well. And then getting VCs to buy into your story, saying, hey, this sounds interesting. So finally, when a venture fund did invest in my story, they did get very excited at the potential that this technology had to offer. And then I had to pivot my business from enzymes to biopharmaceuticals. So I'm very used to pivoting.
Those are really important points that you're making, Kiran. One, in being able to articulate an idea, being able to present it in a way that gets the attention of your, of the recipient. Absolutely. And I think we have just a few minutes left, which is why I thought I'd bring you in, ask you really about whether you require regulatory frameworks that will help drive women in the future. Is the
actually, we've just been talking about how do we bring in enabling regulations that can fast track the process of taking an idea from the lab to the market, in our case, okay?
True.
And interestingly, I think I've been discussing it with the CDSCO, and they are very supportive of this idea of saying, look, if you could actually come up with the restricted emergency use approval process during COVID times for vaccines because there was an emergency, why don't you use the same model to really develop, whatever it is, a medtech product or a new drug or a new vaccine or anything in the life tech area that is addressing an unmet need, that is actually, coming up with a very novel way of treating a disease. If that is the way we actually go about developing an idea and abbreviating the regulatory path, the investment needs of taking such an idea to the market is much lower. And then you see much more innovation coming into the fore.
Thank you. On that note, Kiran, those are very, very valuable points. And we hope in future, a lot of this will come into play to help more entrepreneurs as they go on. Thank you once again. And I'll hand this over to Isha.